Thank you, Scott. That was beautiful. Remember years ago I did a funeral, and it was in the morning, and there was a bagpiper, and after the benediction, they released some doves, and then the bagpiper played Amazing Grace as he walked away from the funeral and into the woods. And it was one of the most moving experiences I've ever had. And so thank you for that music. It was beautiful. Really appreciate it. I get my clicker out. Last week, I talked about the Great Disappointment and how on October 22nd, 1844, how many of our early pioneers and the people that believed in the Advent movement, the Millerite movement, that night, or the next morning as they went to bed after waiting all night, they wept and they cried and they couldn't get over this. And I want to talk about what happened next. How did the Seventh-day Adventist Church start to evolve and progress out of this Millerite movement, out of this Advent movement? How did one of the most prolific and greatest movements in the world today in terms of religion really get started out of that? And so I want to start, of course, with William Miller, who was the leader of this great Millerite movement and who had preached the second coming of Jesus on October 22nd, 1844. Let me share a couple pictures. Here's his home, and that's still there. It's a National Historic Monument today. And if you go through the house, it still has all of his old furniture and everything there, his writing desk and all of those kinds of things. And then on that same property, this is Ascension Rock. This is where that group of Advent believers with William Miller waited for Jesus to come back. The trees weren't there at the time, and so when you look out over the rocks, it was a wide open view, and it faced the east so that they could see Jesus when he came back again. And what a great disappointment for them that Jesus didn't come back. You know, William Miller himself, it's interesting, after the great disappointment, he was starting to get up in age, and so he went back home. And he spent the next 4 or 5 years. He died in 1849. So he spent the rest of his life there at his house. And you may have thought that he would have become very discouraged and downtrodden and really thought that maybe he looked like a fool or something because it didn't happen. But he didn't. As friends and different ones would come to talk to him, he was always very positive and upbeat. And he always believed that the Lord would come back again in his lifetime. And I hope many of you have that same vision for your life, that all of you do, that you believe the Lord could come back in your lifetime. And that's the way William Miller was. He never gave up the hope of Jesus coming back again. He knew he was off somewhere, but he knew that Jesus would still come back. He just didn't have it quite right that way. And it's interesting what Mrs. White says about William Miller. She had a vision or a dream about him. And in this vision and dream, she saw William Miller laid to rest early in his life because there were a lot of people that were coming around William Miller, and they were starting to affect his thinking with error, with wrong ideas. And so God allows William Miller to go to sleep so that he wouldn't be persuaded and convicted on this error and false teachings. And so he sleeps awaiting Jesus to come again. And she sees him. In vision, she sees him in the kingdom of heaven when Jesus comes again. Now, I want to share with you some of those early believers and where they come in this picture. Now, the founders of the Seventh-day Adventist Church have always been considered James and Ellen White and Joseph Bates. Now, James and Ellen White, of course, they weren't married. She was Ellen Harmon at the time of the Great Disappointment. She was 17 years old. Well, when she turns 18, her and James get married. And they were introduced by some mutual friends and traveled together and things. And they were married. He's about, he was 26 at the time, so 8 years older than her. Today that might be kind of a scandal, but back in those days it wasn't that unusual. And when we look at Ellen, of course, we know her prophetic ministry and everything. But James White was really the leader, besides Joseph Bates, that really started the Advent movement after the Great Disappointment. He was a great leader, but he also believed strongly in publishing work. And he started some of our first pamphlets, sharing with people about the Seventh-day Adventist message and getting the word out there. He started many of our institutions and began building up the work as time went on. And then there's Joseph Bates. Now, Joseph Bates was a retired sea captain. And when we talk about that early movement, I know these are pictures of when they're all older, But most of the people that started that movement were in their teens and 20s or early 30s. It was a very young movement. And Joseph Bates was the exception to the rule. He was a retired sea captain, had his own ship, and he'd retired and sold his ship and everything by the time 1844 comes along. And he gets very caught up in the movement and sharing the message. He's also one of the early Sabbath day keepers. He was presented the Sabbath and started keeping the Sabbath. But he was also one of the leaders of that early church. He was the elder statesman of the church, and so became quite a leader that way within the church itself. And so we have James Ellen White and Joseph Bates, and then J.N. Andrews was just a young man. In the Seventh-day Adventist Church, he was probably one of our most brilliant scholars we've ever had in the church. He really knew how to study the Bible, and he learned the languages of the Bible and everything. He was very good that way. He was 15 years old when he began sharing about the Great Disappointment and when it came along, and he was already preaching about the Lord coming back, and he just automatically started getting into the work of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which would later become the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And he was one of the first also to accept the Sabbath message. And in fact, he has a book that he was well known for that was written called The History of the Sabbath. And he did a chronology of the Sabbath and how the Sabbath comes into the Bible and where it's at, and from the Bible to our up to his time. And in 1860, he's the one that really pushed for the church to become organized into the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And the church finally becomes organized in 1863. But he was very instrumental in pushing the church in that direction. And in 1874, he is sent overseas as our first official missionary of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Then you have John Byington. John Byington became the first president of the General Conference. Now, James White, they asked him to be the president, and he said, no. He said, I am too well known, and there's too much controversy around my name and things. James White was a very type A personality, and wasn't always the most diplomatic. And yet he really had a love and a zeal for the Lord and sharing the gospel and sharing the work of God around the world in the Bible, and especially those around him. But he was a very organized leader and a very matter-of-fact kind of leader. And so he said, let's let somebody else. James White later served 10 years as the General Conference president, but he turns it over to John Byington. And J.N. Andrews also became a president of the General Conference. But John Byington is best known as the first president of the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists starting in 1863. And then we have Frederick Wheeler. Frederick Wheeler is probably best known for, during the movement and during the William Miller movement, he was a pastor of the Christian Church in Washington, New Hampshire. And he was at some meetings, and Rachel Oakes Preston was there. Rachel Oakes Preston was a Seventh-day Baptist. And Frederick Wheeler is there, and she's talking about the Sabbath, and she introduces him to the Sabbath. Well, he thinks about it, and he goes back and he studies about it and realizes, oh, it's right. It's there in the Bible. He goes back to his church in Washington, New Hampshire. Let's see if I have a picture of that. No. Washington, New Hampshire, which is the first Seventh-day Adventist church. You can go there today. It's a little church, and it's a beautiful church. There's a Sabbath walk that you can take, and there's several pillars along the way that have sayings on them. And when you go to that Washington, New Hampshire church, it probably seats, maybe 30 to 40 people. It's not a very big church, and in those days, the women sat on one side and the men sat on the other side, and they were separated by a partition between them, so that one couldn't sit on the other side that way. And he took the message of the Sabbath to his congregation, and all of the believers in the congregation went along with him, and they all switched over to the Sabbath. So it was the first congregation that becomes a Seventh-day Adventist congregation, and that's really the first church that we consider as part of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, the first organized church. Now we get into Hiram Edson, and I want to get back into now what happens after the Great Disappointment. Hiram Edson lived in the western part of New York. It was along the Erie Canal in Port Gibson, And he was one of those early believers who believed in the 10th day and the 7th month idea of October 22nd, 1844. And of course, we know that back in history, that was the Day of Atonement. We know it today as Yom Kippur. And if you look on almost any calendar that has the dates of different things that go on, you'll see that Yom Kippur this year, I believe it was October 6th or 7th, right around there. And it varies from year to year, but that was the Day of Atonement for the Jews back then. And we're going to talk a little about that a little bit later. But he, along with a small group, they gathered to pray. And of course, the Lord didn't come, and he said, what a time of sadness. Men and women all cried. It seemed they could not pray. Worse it was to them if they had lost father, mother, all brothers and sisters, and every friend. The night drew on, and some quietly slipped away to their homes. The others stayed, scarcely noting their going, and still they wept and grieved, until at last the dawn of a new day came. And its grayness seemed the grayness of their lives. Was there then, they reasoned to themselves, to be no second coming of Christ? Was the Bible all false? Was there no Jesus who had died for them? Should they never see the golden home city of the redeemed, nor walk in that country whose inhabitants should say, I am no more sick? Could there be no God at all? Hiram Edson says, not so, brethren. It can't be. We know there's a God. And I know how many times the Lord has sent us light and help and has been with us. So we know that there's a God. And so the brethren that morning, they left and they went to their different houses. And as they closed the door, the little group that was left, he said, let's go out to the barn and let's kneel down and pray. And so Hiram Edson and that little group, they went out to the barn and they kneeled down and they prayed. And he said, we just were comforted. We knew the Lord heard our prayers. We knew that God accepted our prayers, even if we didn't have the answers. And it was like they were promised that God would help them understand the disappointment, even though they didn't understand it at the time. And after breakfast, Edson said to one of his friends, he said, and we don't know who it was, he said, let's go to the neighbors that were Millerites and had faced a great disappointment. We said, let's go comfort some of our neighbors. Let's go encourage them. Let's see if we can keep them walking in the way. And so they start out across the lots, and they're going through a cornfield. And the corn had already been cut. It was this time of year, and harvest was done for them. And they were both deeply thinking their own thoughts as they walked along. And they were just kind of walking side by side. And they came to the middle of the field, and all of a sudden, Hiram Edson just stops. Right in the middle of the field. And he said it felt as if like there was a hand on me stopping me. And it seemed as though, he said, a glory shone around him. And looking as in a vision, he saw that Jesus, our high priest, had entered that day into the most holy place of the sanctuary in heaven. And there he would stay until he had finished his work of cleansing it. Now, as he's standing there and he's seeing this vision of Jesus going into the most holy place in the sanctuary on the Day of Atonement to begin the cleansing of the sanctuary, as he's looking at all of this, his friend that had gone with him just kept on walking. He wasn't even paying attention. He was just lost in thought, thinking about what happened. Why didn't Jesus come back? And we don't know what all he was thinking, but he kept walking. And he comes to himself on the other side of the field, and he looks back and he looks over at Brother Ed, and he says, what are you stopping for? Which would be a logical question. What are you doing out there in the middle of the field? Why'd you stop? Why didn't you keep going? And Edson called back. He said, he's answering our morning prayer. Talking about that time of prayer in the barn there. And he said, God is answering our morning prayer. And then Edson comes up to his friend and he begins to tell him what he saw. He said, my mind is carried to the 10th and 11th chapters of Revelation, where John was told to take a little book from the angel's hand and eat it. It tasted like honey in the mouth, but when we had eaten it, it was bitter as gall. That is our experience, brother, said Hiram Edson. We have taken the book of the prophecies. Was it not sweet when we took it to know that Jesus was coming yesterday? But now it is bitter, very bitter. Yet he says we must prophesy again before many people, nations, and tongues. And the sanctuary I saw is in heaven. And Jesus yesterday entered upon it
his work of cleansing it. And it seemed kind of strange and new to them. They had never thought about it like this before. And then they went on to tell their brethren. Now, among their friends was a Dr. Hahn. And he lived in Canandaigua, Canada, at 12 miles away. And he and his wife were believers in Jesus' second coming. And there was a young man there by the name of O.L. Crozier. And Crozier had been studying this, and he'd been studying these prophecies. And when Edson told him what had happened, he began to study these things even more and the second Advent message. And so between the two of them, they published a little paper called The Day Dawn to help those who had been discouraged and who had gone through this experience, to give them a little more light and encouragement. And sometimes it wouldn't come out weekly. Sometimes it would come out monthly because they didn't have much money. And whatever money they had, they put into the work. That was like Joseph Bates in the 1844 movement. He was a sea captain. He retired very wealthy. But by 1844, he was dirt poor and didn't have anything left because he had poured it all into the work. I mean, sometimes in publishing in his ministry, sometimes in publishing, he would go out and he would spend food money for papers and pamphlets to hand out about the second coming of Jesus. And his wife would get so frustrated with him. She'd say, "That's our food money. What are we going to do for food?" And he'd say, "Oh, don't worry, God will provide." I mean, think about it, ladies, if your husband said that to you after spending the food money. And yet they were so strongly in touch with God. They just knew God would provide. And that's the way it was with this Day Dawn. As the money came, they would share God's love with others and witness. And so Crozier began to study and see what he could find out about this sanctuary question and what was going on. And he realized sanctuary means sacred place. And so he began to look again at Daniel 8:14, which we know is the key verse to the 2,300 days. And it says, "Unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed." And so this is what he began to look at. What did it mean by the cleansing of the sanctuary? And he found sanctuary means a sacred place where God dwells. And he also realized that the Bible is never called the earth the sanctuary. And that was a new thought to them because, remember, in their day and age, the prevalent thought in Europe and around the world and even in America was that the earth was the sanctuary and that in 1844, on October 22nd, God would come and he would burn up the earth and cleanse the sanctuary. That was a prevalent thought. And so they didn't even think about a sanctuary in heaven. And so that was happening. Now, and then we come to Hebrews chapter 8, and this was another thing that Crozier was looking at as he was looking at all of this. And in Hebrews 8, 1 and 2, it says, "Now of the things which we have spoken, this is the sum. We have such an high priest who is set on the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens, a minister of the sanctuary and of the true tabernacle, which the Lord pitched and not man." And they began looking at those texts, and they thought, oh, there's a heavenly sanctuary. It really is in heaven. And is Christ our high priest? And what does this really mean? And when they realized that the one on earth that the children of Israel had was really just a sample or a replica of the one in heaven. And Hebrews 8:5 says, "Who serve under the example and shadow of heavenly things, as Moses was admonished of God when he was about to make the tabernacle. For see, saith he, that thou make all things according to the pattern shown to thee in the mount." And so they began to realize, oh, the sanctuary is not the earth. The sanctuary is the real one in heaven, and God is ministering for us on our behalf. God is our high priest. And so they began to look at the old sanctuary in the Old Testament, and they looked at how it was built and what it meant, and they saw there that it was a symbol, the sacrifices were a symbol of Christ, who would come and die for us. So everything to do with the ceremonial laws in the Old Testament remind us of Christ as our sacrifice, of how he would die for us. And in Revelation 14, 6 and 7, they brought these in. They began to look at these texts. By the way, if I'm going to go through these rather quickly. If you want to know more about it and you want to go in detail to these things, you have to come on Wednesday night at 7 o'clock when Joel is doing a study through the book of Daniel. He's on chapter 6 right now, so he's getting real close to Daniel 8. So be sure and come Wednesday nights. In Revelation 14, 6 and 7, and I saw another angel fly in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach unto them that dwell on the earth, to every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. And saying with a loud voice, fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment is come, and worship him that made heaven and earth and the sea and the fountains of waters. So then they began to tie in this idea of a judgment, and the idea that God is going to judge everyone. And he's going to decide who's good and who's bad in this judgment, and decide who's going to be saved and who's going to be lost. And so they began to put all this together with the sanctuary service. And that's where they looked at this 2,300 days or years. And I'll just give you 2 dates here that are important now. If you want to know the rest of these, you've got to come on Wednesday night. Okay? 457 BC. Now, Ezra, in the book of Ezra, is a decree to go forth and rebuild Jerusalem. And we know that that's the beginning of the 2,300-year prophecy, 457 BC of Daniel 8. And if you take that and you go down to 2,300 years later, it's 1844. And October 22nd was the day of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, that year in 1844. And that's how they came up with this date. And that's how Joseph Bates came up with this date. But now all of a sudden, with Crozier and with some of the other early pioneers, he began to look at all of this, and ones like Edson and Hahn and the Whites and Joseph Bates, and they began to see that the sanctuary that it was talking about was not the earth, but it was talking about the heavenly sanctuary. And Jesus cleansing the earth in the sense that he's judging and deciding who's going to be saved and who's going to be lost. So instead of coming out of the most holy place for us, and there you see the priest administering on the Day of Atonement and the cleansing of the sanctuary. And turn with me to Leviticus 23. And so instead of going into the sanctuary, Jesus is coming out of the most holy place. It is what they thought. But instead of coming out, he was going in. And so judgment started in 1844. So ever since 1844, we've in a sense been living on borrowed time. And that's the last time prophecy of the Bible. So we know that Jesus' coming has to be getting very, very close. Okay, so we look at Leviticus chapter 23, and I want to look at verses 27 to 29. It says, also on the 10th day of the 7th month, there shall be a day of atonement. And of course, this is the Jewish calendar, so you can't go by our calendar that we use here in America. It's a Jewish calendar. There shall be a day of atonement. It shall be an holy convocation unto you, and ye shall afflict your souls, an offering made by fire unto the Lord. And ye shall do no work on that same day, for it is a day of atonement, to make an atonement for you before the Lord your God. Just briefly, what happens on the Day of Atonement is the high priest, it's the only day of the year when he can go into the most holy place. And what he does is before he goes in, he sacrifices a lamb, and he takes the blood, and he goes in, and the only time of the year he goes into the second compartment, or he goes into the compartment where the Ark of the Covenant is at, and he places blood on the Ark of the Covenant. And when he comes back out, the camp is cleansed. But before he goes into the sanctuary, before the people come to the Day of Atonement, they have confessed their sins, they've made everything right before God, and so now they come for this very special solemn service. And tradition has it that the high priest wore bells on his robe, at the bottom of his robe, and he had a rope tied to him. Because if there was any sin in the camp, when he went into the most holy place, he would be struck dead. But we don't know of any place in the whole Old Testament where it says the priest was struck dead. You know what that tells me? They took it very seriously. We call the church the sanctuary. Do we take it seriously when we come to church? We're in the presence of God. We're meeting with God here. And that's what the high priest was doing. And then he would come out. And as he came out, what he would do then is he would take his hands and he would place his hands on the goat, and he would confess all the sins of the people for the whole year. And then the goat would be led out into the wilderness by a strong young man. He'd take it out in the wilderness and let it go free. Well, you know what happens then to a tame lamb out in the wilderness? Probably bear or lion or something else ate that goat, destroyed it. Well, the goat represented the devil, because God tells us that ultimately the devil is responsible for sin. And the idea of sin is placed back upon the devil. It doesn't mean we aren't responsible for the sin in our lives, but when we confess them to the Lord, those sins are taken away. And they're given back to the devil who they belong to. And so this is what happened on the Day of Atonement. And so for those early believers, think of how encouraging that would have been. Think of what a blessing that would have been. To realize we weren't wrong. We had the date right. We had everything right except that we didn't realize there was a heavenly sanctuary instead of an earthly sanctuary. Instead of this earth. And they realized that Jesus was still coming back, but now they're in a time of judgment. They're in a time where they really need to be serious about their walk with God because Jesus could come at any time. And Psalm 139, 23 and 24 is a reminder for all of us. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts, and see if there be any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. And I think the challenge for all of us is each day of our lives to search our hearts, to let Jesus lead and guide, to make sure that we've confessed before the Lord. And not because God asks us to do these things, but because we know that it draws us closer to Jesus. And we can be ready when Jesus comes again. Because really, after all, isn't that what we want? Eternal life. And we want all of our friends to be ready too, don't we? And that's why that little group that started out of that great disappointment became the great Advent movement that we have today. Because they didn't want to keep it to themselves. They didn't grow discouraged and disappointed. They had hope and encouragement. They realized Jesus is coming back again. And we want to be ready, but not only us, but we want a world ready for Jesus to come again. And so I hope that each of you will take seriously the call to share God's love with others, to help this dying world know of a Jesus who loves them and who has saved them. As we close, would you take your hymnals out, and let's turn to number 341. To God be the glory, because he truly is the one that we give the glory to. Number 341.